Hey folks, Corey here. Before we dive into today's episode, I just wanted to tell you about another program that I've come to really respect and enjoy. Best of the Left is unlike anything else out there because it's all about curation rather than creation. Jay Tomlinson has been producing the show since its inception and uses his years of experience to shape each episode in ways that dive deeper and bring out more details on topics than is usually possible from a single source. Each episode focuses like a laser on a different topic, allowing deeper coverage than any one show is capable of. With a deep catalog of episodes, Best of the Left has effectively created an archive of the progressive movement over the past decade and a half. The power of curation is in the bringing together of a variety of voices that combined become greater than the sum of their parts. And the show doesn't just curate news and opinion, but also activism, so listeners can turn information into effective advocacy. Just in recent weeks, they've aired episodes about native land back, about neurodiversity, about positive masculinity. It's all relevant topics that many of us are engaged in today. And sometimes, as we know here on this program, engaged citizens can disagree on important matters, but I always come away more informed. But if you only have time for one episode, make it their milestone 1,500th show. 1,500 shows! That's the show that Jay sets aside his normal curation format and instead lays out as many of the smartest ideas he's had or come across in all his years of thinking deeply about politics. It's definitely worth your time. As you'd expect, you can follow Best of the Left anywhere you get your podcasts. That's Best of the Left. And now, back to our show.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and I really am grateful to have this place to talk about these big ideas pertaining to faith and politics and our culture. And I get to talk about it with such interesting, accomplished people who come in goodwill, in good faith. And today, right out of the gate, I want to give you a taste of what we'll be discussing today. As our guest put it in his new book, truth-telling and sincere efforts to repair past damage are met with defensive and often frantic attempts to protect the social and economic status quo. There is measurable progress, but it often comes at a price, and it is rarely linear. Oh, man. Wow, that couldn't be truer. I mean, my own experience comports with that. But before we start, it is my honor to share that we are part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And please remember, if you could take the time to leave a review on whichever podcast app you're on, that would really, really be helpful. Certain ones allow for ratings only, and that's great. Others give an option for writing a review, and that really does help us in terms of our rankings so that others can discover our program. And then, of course, tell a friend, tell somebody about an episode you heard or how wrong or crazy you think I am and how crazy this all sounds. Just tell them and then see if you end up getting into a conversation about politics or religion, and maybe you'll be able to not kill each other over such subjects. The easiest way to find us is our main site, which is www.politicsandreligion.us, or feel free to connect with me on all the socials, even Threads. I am at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E, S as in Sam. Nathan at Corey S. Nathan. All of that helps get the word out so more people can participate in the conversation like the one we're having today with Dr. Robert P. Jones. Dr. Jones is the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute. You might remember us speaking with Dr. Melissa Deckman a few months ago, the CEO of PRRI. And today we get to talk to PRRI's founder, Robbie Jones. Dr. Jones is also the author of the forthcoming book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, as well as the award-winning books White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and The End of White Christian America. as well as other books. Robbie writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic, Time, Religion News Service, and other outlets. And you might recognize him from his appearances on CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. He also writes weekly at Robert P. Jones on Substack. It's a great newsletter for those dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. Dr. Jones holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and an undergrad degree in computing science and mathematics from Mississippi College. Now, that caught me off guard. From science and math to an MDiv at a Baptist seminary is far from the typical route, but we'll get to that. Robbie, thanks so much for joining me today. How you doing?
Hey, great. No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Now, in reading this latest book, it seems like the work you've been doing over the past 10 years, maybe longer, it's been like this long awakening. So I was hoping if we could start, if you could describe how you grew up. And there was one illustration that you provided toward the end of the book, like the big Western town place set that you got, costumes you detail, how our experiences entrench a certain mindset that seems benign at first glance, like playing cowboys and Indians, but is really part of the hidden roots of white supremacy.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, so in the deep, deep South. Grew up very active in the Southern Baptist Church of my youth, and that was kind of a part of everyday things. My family roots go back. It's still in the South, like 6 generations in Middle Georgia. In fact, my siblings and I are the first generation not to have grown up and live in either Bibb County or Twiggs County, Georgia, in 6 generations since the early 1800s. Roots go back fairly deep. And as you said, the last 3 books, and the first one of the last 3 came out in 2016, and they were kind of an accidental trilogy, I guess. I wish I could say 10 years ago I had this big master plan and I'm going to lay out these 3 books and here's the way it's going to be. But they really have been the result of my own journey of just kind of trying to put one foot in front of the other, see as much as I can see, capture it, and write it up. And then as I kind of continue to think and do research and talk to people and learn, realizing, there's another, kind of turn of the prism that I need to make here in order to, and really it is about me trying to wrestle this problem to the ground. And that is like, where does the kind of culture and religion that I grew up with, inside this kind of white Christian Protestant world, where does my faith end and these kind of subtle and then not so subtle commitments to white supremacy begin? Because they were all wrapped up together and in ways that I wasn't that aware of growing up. And as you said, kind of only in retrospect, when I think about, what does playing cowboys and Indians do? And when I read about it in the book, it was like always the fight over who was going to have to be the Indians because they were going to lose. Yeah. Right. And also just little subtle things like, our little cowboy town, all of the cowboys, there was an entire town, there were buildings, there was civilization, and the little Indian plastic pieces that came with the set had no homes. They were literally homeless. So the only thing you could really do was set up the buildings here and then attack the little outpost of civilization with the little Indian figures. That's really the only script that made sense. And so even those little subtle things, right, kind of reinforcing who's civilized, who's not, who's the dominant culture, who's an inferior culture, right? These things were kind of built even into the little play sets I had growing up.
Yeah. And as you put it, it's these subtle things. So it sounds like it wasn't necessarily like a snap of the fingers and all of a sudden you woke up one day and realized, holy cow, I'm part of this larger system of, this mindset, but it was a gradual thing where you began to realize, and the scales didn't fall off suddenly, but gradually. Is that fair to say?
That's right. Yeah, no, it's been a, painfully and when I look back on it, sometimes embarrassingly slow process for me. And, there's little moments that you can point to that are significant. Like one was, it wasn't until I was in my 20s, that I realized what the word Southern in Southern Baptist Convention meant, right? In the name of the denomination in which I grew up. And, I always took it to be a geographical marker, right? Just a compass point kind of thing, because we were, after all, Southern. But it wasn't until I was in seminary and I finally had a Baptist history professor tell it to me straight. And he just said, look, this is about a Southern way of life, which was a polite way of saying support for enslaving other people, right? Yeah. And that then was burst into the Confederacy. And in fact, the split between Northern and Southern Baptists predates the political secession. And in some ways, it was the dress rehearsal for political secession because in 1845, both the Methodists and the Baptists, which are the two larger Protestant denominations, split over the issue of slavery. And that happens in 1845 prior, to the political secession during the Civil War. And many of the people who were the architects of the religious secession movement were actually in the room in Alabama, right, for the political secession. They were the chaplains and saying the prayers and that kind of, and in many cases also the political leaders. So, just again, not until my 20s, despite going to all kinds of Sunday school classes and, education programs. I was very active in church all through my adolescence and went to a Baptist college. And it wasn't until I had one professor who finally told me that story. And that was like, and again, that was in my 20s. And that wasn't like a once and for all awakening. And as you said, scales fell from my eyes, all that. But it was like this little seed of like, oh, things are not all what they have seemed to be here. Yeah. It's just been this kind of gradual process.
What's interesting is you deal with that 1845 Southern Baptist, how they split off from the larger Baptist convention. I don't even know if I'm using the right vocabulary there, but one of the things that kept on coming up for me throughout the book was how do we recognize in ourselves the reactions, those impulses, the language that people used, and you trace historical events in three different distinct parts of the country, atrocities that occurred to indigenous peoples and African Americans in those three different parts, and the language that was deployed to justify such atrocities, the language that was used even by Christian pastors in the aftermath of the atrocities. And then, there's something, I think it was toward the end of the book, where you recounted a lot of half a dozen, 6 of the major Southern Baptist seminaries very rarely come together for a joint statement. But there was a joint statement, I think it was just recently in 2020 or 2021. That it's just striking, like I said, the question that continued to occur to me throughout is how do we recognize that language and those justifications and those impulses in ourselves? And there it was, half a dozen Southern Baptist seminaries came together in reaction to CRT, critical race theory. So is that fair to draw that line from the 1845 to the 2020 joint statement, or am I making too much of a stretch there?
Well, no, I think this is one of the things that history can do for us, right? Is that because I think it's easy, most Southern Baptists, and I would have said this too as a kid. I mean, most Southern Baptists would say, "Oh, slavery was awful, right? Terrible, horrible chapter in American history," and largely saw ourselves as disconnected from that completely, despite the fact that we were sitting in the denomination that was like the chief supporter of that worldview, right? And used Christian principles and ideals to support enslaving other people, biblical, quoting the Bible, right, to support that. And I think it's easy for us to go, oh, how could that possibly be? And how could they have been so wrong? And yet today kind of miss the similar impulses in ourselves. And I think, we have a clue, when we are, repressing things, that should be a clue that we're kind of off on the wrong track. And as you said, I mean, so there's 6 Southern Baptist seminaries. And as far as I know, I tried to, scrounge around and find it. I cannot find a single thing that the presidents of those seminaries have gotten together to say is of sufficient concern that we're going to come together, issue a joint statement on it. And the only thing they've done that for was to denounce critical race theory and essentially to denounce the ongoing existence of systemic racism in the country. So think about that for a minute, right? Not poverty, not climate change, not hunger, not sexual abuse that's rampant in their own churches, right? But denouncing critical race theory seemed like the thing that was important enough for them to come together and make a statement. And I think it's pretty clear when something like that has happened, it's a defensive move, and it's a defensive protectionist move, right? And that something has gone deeply wrong when that happens.
That was another question that kept on hitting me in the face throughout the book, and oftentimes it's not that it's not that I'm wagging my finger; it's that I'm grappling with the church that I became a part of in my late 20s. I'm grappling with what primarily defines us. There's a quote from a fairly recent speech that Governor Tate Reeves gave about the ban of teaching of CRT in Mississippi schools. He said, "Children are dragged to the front of the classroom and are coerced to declare themselves as oppressors, taught that they should feel guilty because of the color of their skin." So number one, this is absolutely not happening. But my question is, the image of it serves a certain mythological function. And my question is, why even pretend that's the case? What purpose does it serve to conjure these images? Is it a grievance that we need to underscore or justify or make? I'm trying to make sense of it. So
I do think it's a politics of outrage and grievance that has been cultivated here. I think that's right. And then the question, so why? Why now and why this? And I think we see this movement, particularly in this reactivity from white Americans and white Christian Americans using religion in this way. Whenever there has been movement toward Black equality, movement toward racial equality in the country, not just with African Americans, but others like Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, et cetera. There's a kind of reactive move. So we saw it, after the Civil War, right? And for this coming from Mississippi is particularly rich, right? Because, the Mississippi was reaching out to folks like the United Daughters of the Confederacy to set the tone for history textbooks after the Civil War, right? To ensure that there was a sanitized, literally whitewashed version of what the Civil War was about being taught to the next generation of Mississippi school children. So that's the history, in Mississippi. So I think it's especially rich for the governor of Mississippi to be citing, something like this. But I do think it's this. There has to be a kind of conjured outrage, but it's really about this sense that they're no longer controlling the narrative, right? And I think that's what's different in our day is that we are living in this moment of reckoning where, these old assumptions, that have everything back to, let's just play cowboys and Indians and nobody will think anything about that. Let's only talk about, or let's say out loud, as the Florida governor of Florida did, that, Black people got some benefits from slavery, right? It wasn't so bad. We'll say those kinds of things, right? And we're in this moment of reckoning. Confederate statues are coming down. There's a whole reevaluation of that public landscape. And I think this is a defensive reaction really to the moment, we're in.
It's interesting because now it occurs to me that a lot of it is the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves to have a certain understanding of who we are. And some of that is mythology to make ourselves into the heroes or, these tragic figures, or there's something about that. Now, you use at times the first person plural, like in the very last paragraph of the book, starts out with "we white Christians." So I did want to clarify the use of that, the first person plural here. Are you using "we" as a reflection of who you are, or is it more of like an exhortation of who you anticipate or hope to be reading the book?
No, that's a good question. In that passage, I whenever, and particularly with the phrase "we white Christians," I'm using it as in a very personal way, right? That's how I identify, right? A person of European descent, mostly British descent in my case, British and Welsh, identify as Christian still, and So it's really, you mentioned finger wagging, before. And, I think one of the things I've worked very hard to do is to write, particularly these books about white Christianity, and make it very clear that I'm an insider to this conversation, right? I'm not standing way on the outside, wagging my finger, at these backwoods Christians. Like, these are like my people, my family, my relatives. This is the world, in which I grew up in and still live in many ways. It's, if anything, it's a kind of call and a plea for us to be better. Interestingly, it was, Baldwin, I think James Baldwin, African American writer, when he was asked so many times about hope, and he writes so incisively about how deep the racial problems in this country are, and so he was often asked, well, gosh, if all that's true, where do you find hope? And he would often kind of come back to this fairly simple phrase, and he would say, at the end of the day, I have not lost faith that we can be better. And it was that simple for him. And I heard that resonate or echo in, I took a tour with a Native American man named Jim Bear Jacobs, who is also working with the Minnesota Council of Churches, and he gave a tour of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, Native American sites around there. And I just happened to be appended that day. I was just there by myself, but I got appended to a group of predominantly white Christian church that was on the tour at the same time. And Jim Bear Jacobs ended the tour somebody asked him a question, what do you want us to take away from this tour? And this is essentially what he said. He said, well, if I can just be completely honest with you, I don't just need white Christians to be smarter. I need them to be better. So I think that's really, what I'm hopefully up to at the end of the day, trying to be better myself, be more honest myself, and hopefully, call others who come from this background to do the same.
Yeah. I grew up observantly Jewish. My family went to an Orthodox synagogue before I became a Christian in my late 20s. And one of my revelations a few years into becoming a Christian is that the way Jews, our default posture with the prophets is different than the default posture of my brothers and sisters at the church. I don't mean to make light of this, but I think we understood that, whether it was Malachi, Isaiah, Jeremiah, we were talking amongst ourselves, as opposed to the prophets standing up on the street corner and yelling at the Ninevites or the Persians or the Babylonians. We were, the exhortations were for ourselves. So it seems to me that this disposition is more in accordance. I'm not trying to, blow smoke and say that you're a Malachi of our time, but but I think that's the right disposition. Is we have to be humble in that way, and always be checking ourselves in terms of where our own culpability is, not necessarily that we need to be taking the flagellum to ourselves all the time, but there's a humility that seems lacking, and I think the book is helpful in that regard. It's an important contribution to the conversation. Now, you mentioned your work with some of the indigenous folks. One of the central questions that you deal with throughout the book. You say we almost choose between the doctrine of discovery and democracy. We can't have both. Have you begun to think that, first of all, I do want to dive into the doctrine of discovery. We had the pleasure of having Stephen Newcomb on the show a few months ago. Yeah. And so that, I'm baffled by my own complete ignorance to this history. So I was hoping that you could shed light on a little bit more light on the doctrine of discovery, but also then if you would, have you begun to think about the folks that we go to church with, whether this might sound harsh to say, but I'm wondering if some of the folks I go to church with actually value democracy itself. So
Yeah.
it's a big question because Doctrine of Discovery would require an entire episode unto itself. But if you would.
Well, it's great that you had Steve on. I've learned a lot from Steve Newcomb's work, and he's done some really groundbreaking work along with some other indigenous scholars on this. And in fact, I'm right there with you in terms of my own ignorance about this. It's possible, like I had heard the term Doctrine of Discovery, in my graduate work or something, but it never really registered to me as something central that I should be paying attention to that explains anything unique or consequential to our current situation. But the more that I kind of read indigenous scholars, Vine Deloria, Robert Miller, others who've really written on this, the more I was convinced that, wow, we have really missed something in our history by not centering this thing that came to be called the Christian Doctrine of Discovery. So basically, what it is a set of 15th century documents that came out of the Vatican. Now, I should say that it's immediately people are going to think, oh, it's Catholic, but I should recall that this is before the Catholic Protestant split, right? So everybody in Western Europe is under this jurisdiction. The only splits were between the Orthodox and the Catholic. There was no Catholic Protestant split at this point. So all the Western European states, were affiliated really with the Vatican and the Pope in Rome. And so why in the 15th century? Well, it's the first European contact with people in the Americas. And so it raises not only political questions, as in, can we, what rights do those people have vis-a-vis us? Can we go in and conquer them? And it raises religious questions like, who are these people? What's their relationship to the church's mission to baptize and missionize the world? And these things got really melded. And what happened is the heads of state appealed to the closest thing there was to international law at the time, and that was the Pope, about so give us a ruling. It's essentially what they said. And it's really astonishing when you read the documents about what came down. They essentially said the logic of the rulings was basically this, that the criteria for whether somebody had human rights that ought to be respected or not was whether or not they were Christian. And if these people were not Christian, they were considered, quote, enemies of Christ, end quote. So that's all non-Christian people. That's Jews, that's Muslims, that's all Native Americans or indigenous people in the Americas that fall into this category of enemies of Christ. And if they are enemies of Christ, it went on to spell out then what was permissible. And what was permissible was to conquer, to kill, to occupy, to steal their goods. And then these phrases that just, still rattle around in my head horrifically. And to, one of the documents says, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, right? Mm-hmm. That's actually written from the hand of the head of the Christian church. And so, these documents, the last one that I kind of traced back to the Americas was written in 1493. That year should sound familiar to folks. It's not the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, right? It's the next year when he returned. And he was asking for permission for more soldiers, more ships, more missionaries to come back and conquer. And he got that permission in a document from the Pope in 1493. So these are very consequential, and they stay with us. People aren't necessarily waving these documents around in later American history, but the core idea that these lands were intended by God to be a kind of promised land for European Christians, that idea is alive, has been alive and well throughout American history, and in fact is still alive and well with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I made it much more of a compound question.
Yeah, there's a second part. Yeah.
Yeah, so to tie that into our mindset today, it seems that retaining this sense of domination, for lack of a better word, is of greater priority than the concept of democracy.
Yeah, it's domination, but it's also, I think, even thicker than that or stronger than that. It's a sense of divine entitlement, right? So it's not just
the supremacy.
So the dominance comes from this sense that, hey, look, we're chosen by God. It's not us, right? We were sort of divinely chosen to occupy this space. So who are we to question it? Is kind of the way the logic runs, right? And so then it also gives you license, if you've been given divine mandate, I mean, all the means that you have at your disposal become legitimate, right?
Yeah.
Including violence. Remind me the second part of the question was
whether we've come to value democracy at all.
Yes, democracy.
Yeah.
Right. So here's what really jumped out at me is through, and particularly as sort of a student of the history of the South, Southern white Christians in particular have always had something of a utilitarian relationship with democracy. And we've loved to play lip service, right, to democracy, right, and say, "Oh no, we're all for democratic principles." But after the Civil War, when Reconstruction actually enfranchised African Americans to vote for the first time, and Mississippi, to stay with my home state, gets a state senator, many elected people to Congress who are people of color, right, who are African Americans, the white power structures wouldn't stand for it, right, and went about systemically disenfranchising black voters across the state. So that was a very narrow period where it was possible to elect, and they used violence, terrorism. The KKK arose during that period to basically make it so that black voters weren't voting because Alexander Percy, who wrote Lanterns on the Levees, Walker Percy's father, the writer, wrote openly about his parents' generation, his father, who he just said, who threw out the ballot boxes without which, if those ballots had been counted, it would have been Negro rule in the county, and just openly talked about them just throwing out the ballots.
Wow.
To prevent African Americans. So we have this long history, I think, that has played lip service to democracy, but when power depended upon it, was more than willing to steal elections, throw away votes, disenfranchise voters. Just one more quick story on this. Like even as late as 1955, I think when the Emmett Till trial, who was this 14-year-old boy who was killed while visiting his uncle in Mississippi from Chicago by two white men, at his trial, it was a trial of all white men. There's 12 white men on the jury. And I did a little more digging on that. That wasn't that unusual in those days to have all white juries. But what was notable is that, of course, you can't be chosen for a jury unless you're registered to vote. That's where the jury pool comes from. They pick from eligible voters. And in 1955, the disenfranchisement of African American voters in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, which, by the way, is about half African American, there were zero registered voters who were African American in 1955. So there was not even anyone eligible to be picked for the jury for that trial. But that's how thorough this anti-democratic, systematic effort at disenfranchising African American voters. So we don't have a great record, right? And those were all justified, by white Christian churches all along the way. And for the few folks that stood up right during the civil rights era, in particular in the South, in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, for the most part, those people's tenures at their churches were very short. They were kicked out of the church when they stood up and said, this is wrong.
Yeah, there's one quote of one of the perpetrators of the killing of Emmett Till. It's after, I think it's after the trial. I can't even read the quote because it's laced with so many N-word, that word. But if in looking at it, it's convicting because the mindset still pervades that sense of, well, we're the good guys, and we're the purveyors of what is good and what is right, and to the extent that they stay in their place, all is good. And that's the mindset from which it came. And to the extent that they thought that this person came, not even a person, they looked at him as something less than a human, came down from Chicago, from the North, that he needed to be put in his place, that it wasn't just about putting him in his place, but as a display for the rest of, that region. And that one hits really close to home, literally for you. That's the area that you grew up in. I was curious how you distilled, like I said before, you dealt with these three distinct regions: Duluth, Minnesota, Mississippi, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. And specifically, you dealt with historic events that atrocities that occurred to indigenous people and African Americans in those three regions. How did that structure occur to you? How did you formulate that way to approach this subject matter?
Yeah, well, it started. It's one of those things where you kind of hone it over time as you're, crafting the book and working on the research. I actually started with about a dozen episodes of white racial violence against African Americans. So Rosewood, Florida, Wilmington, Delaware. Virtually every state has some record of these, and just realized that that in terms of telling a story. 12 was going to be both too much and not enough at the same time. And then just repetitive, right? Not a great way to kind of hear a story. And then also once I started digging in, I think the new thing for me in this book that I haven't really done before is it became really obvious to me that we did need to tell that we often have Native American history and African American history in these kind of two silos. And that we don't put them together, and that by not putting them together, there is this assumption, I think. For example, white Americans just have a black problem, right? And we have a problem with slavery and a problem with the way we treat African Americans. That's what we need to concentrate on to fix. But when you see that the same logic that set up the transatlantic slave trade is the same logic and the same religious justifications for the genocide and removal of Native American people, you realize, we don't just have, quote unquote, a Negro problem or quote unquote, an Indian problem, which is the way white people tend to put it historically, but we've got a white Christian problem, here that we really need to deal with. So as I dug into more of the research, I began to see these connections between the murder of Emmett Till, and the Trail of Tears, right? The forced removal of Native Americans from Mississippi, prior, 100 years prior to that. Same thing in Tulsa, the Tulsa Race Massacre where they burned down the entire African American section of town. And also the whole state of Oklahoma, its entire history it was essentially a dumping ground for forcibly removed Native Americans. Like the U.S. moved something like 80,000 people in a forced migration in the 1820s and 30s from the Southeast, and just forcibly relocated them in what was then unorganized territory, this little hole in the map, and just said, we'll just forcibly put everybody there. And so you can't really understand the burning of Greenwood and Tulsa without understanding that back history. And similarly in Duluth, that not only do we have this horrific lynching that occurs in Duluth, the far north city of Duluth, Minnesota, but Minnesota, despite being this kind of northern state, is also the site of the largest mass execution in U.S. history, and it was when 38 Dakota men were sentenced to death, and that was signed off on by Abraham Lincoln. Right. And so kind of just seeing how tied together these stories are, I think provided for me anyway, like a really different lens for not only seeing these two siloed histories that are usually kept siloed, but for seeing the continuity between them, which I think is often missed. Yeah.
Yeah. And it occurs to me as you're sharing that there must have been plenty of folks in Duluth who survived, witnessed, perhaps participated in the hangings of those Native Americans in the early 1860s, who also then witnessed or even participated in the lynchings of the African American carnival workers in, I think it was 1920. In fact, it was almost 100 years to the day of the killing of George Floyd, if my dates are correct. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very close.
Now, there was somebody, a character, if you will, a person, but a character that shows up, because this could sound really, really grim, but there are signs of hope. So if you can you tell us who Mike Tuscan is and why that's significant?
Yeah, so Mike Tuscan's a police chief. He just retired, actually, but he's a longtime police chief in Duluth. And why he's significant is that it was a relative of his, a great aunt, I believe, of his, who was the woman who falsely accused these three black men of sexually assaulting her, who were then lynched in town. They were kind of arrested and held for questioning, and then pulled out of the jail by a mob and lynched. And 10,000 people in Duluth turned out for that lynching. That's about a tenth of the population of this mostly white town, or overwhelmingly white town. So that's his relative, and he did not know that story until some people began to decide that they really needed to tell the truth about this awful event and make a memorial to these three African American men downtown. And he was the police chief while this was all going on, and so he actually learns about this, participates, in this process, and becomes a very eloquent spokesperson for the need to tell the truth, even when it's painful, even when it's embarrassing, even when it involves your own family, right? But if the community was going to kind of move forward to a place of repair and healing, the truth needed to be told about the story. There needed to be a reckoning about it. And then even, and in Duluth, they were one of the earliest people to make a memorial to the victims of lynching. They did it in the early 2000s. And so when the Black Lives Matter movement erupted, it meant that they had already established this plaza as a memorial to these men. And it was a kind of a gathering place for people to come and organize marches and protests. And it influenced the way that policing happened in Duluth, right? Because as he had this history I interviewed him, and he said, we were very aware there was a policing job to be done. We needed to make sure people were safe, but we also didn't need to over police. We need to let people express themselves as long as everybody was, keeping safe. We just need to kind of let that happen and let that civic space work. So I think it was a kind of real-time example of how work, even 20 years prior to the Black Lives Matter movement, created this space so there was a healthier expression of reckoning that was able to happen in Duluth, and a healthier way of policing that happened in Duluth as well.
Man, there are so many more threads that I want to pull on, but I do feel compelled to ask you. That part of the story is certainly encouraging and pointing in the right direction. But in the midst of uncovering all of this, in the midst of doing this work, has it ever caused you to question your own faith or your own theology, the undergirdings, some of the assumptions, theological assumptions that you've built your faith on?
Oh, I think that's why I'm still writing.
Working that out?
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mentioned earlier, this just from this little kernel of truth about the beginnings of my home denomination is justifying slavery. It has been a long process of trying to disentangle, this white supremacy from my own faith and my own culture. And, where does this, and it's very personal to me, like, two documents I've got that just kind of make it very concrete. I have on the one hand, a family Bible that was handed down to me from 1815. And it's got, it's been a very prized possession. It's a religious object handed down from generation to generation. It's got like all these births and deaths and marriages and a genealogical section in the middle of the Bible. So again, probably the oldest object I have from my mother's side of the family, very prized object. And then I found, doing genealogical research, the estate settlement from that same family that owned the Bible in 1815. And it turns out that, along with, you list everything you own in those estate settlements when someone dies, and along with the feather bed and the table and 6 chairs and the, dozen sheep were 4 human beings listed as assets. Right. Wow. So the same, that's how deep it's been. And I'm not unique. I mean, I should say, like, my family wasn't like the planter class. No, we weren't the kind of gone with the wind plantation owners. Like when you convert their wealth into today's dollars, the entire estate was only worth about $50,000 in today's money, right? So they were kind of basically yeoman, subsistent farmer class types, 200 acres. But they had 4 enslaved human beings in order even to make that work, right? At that level of things. So it's deep in sort of my own family, it's deep in my own denomination. And it's not, it's also just deep in kind of white American culture and white Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, as a whole. And so I think it has been this, I'm not done. I'm sure I'm not done. And it's still kind of ongoing, and we're talking about disentangling centuries of this entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity. So it's going to take more than one generation to sort it out, I think.
It's a project over the course of generations. Yeah. And that work of doing history work on your own family is, wow. It's so eye-opening and sometimes convicting and tragic. And you just reminded me, we uncovered some of the birth certificates and some of the death certificates and marriage certificates and what is it, the census information on our family. And some of the Nathans go back not quite as far as your family, but to the mid-1800s. And the census that was taken in New York City in 1860, one of the Nathans, one of my direct ancestors' brothers, there were different their occupations, street sweeper, merchant, and one of my uncles was his occupation was scoundrel. Like scoundrel,
right.
Yeah, scofflaw, scoundrel, or something along those lines. So I'm like, well, how did he earn that occupation title?
Yeah, I'm guessing the census taker did not show him that piece of paper with what he wrote down.
No, I mean, if I had to guess, I would guess at that time they collected it by knocking on a door and asking the person who lives here and what do they do and what do they do? Yeah, he's a scoundrel, So I did. Here's this is an important question. Toward the end of the book, you said something that really strikes at the heart of the project. Authentic healing flows from, and true repentance is built on, the twin pillars of truth-telling and repair. And you do share some illustrations of how that's happening in Mississippi, in Tulsa, in Duluth, to this day. I was wondering, we've already touched on a couple, but I was wondering if you could share one or two stories of how that's happening, what that looks like now.
Yeah, I'd say like it was where I do find hope is in these stories on the ground, seeing what local people are doing. I think if we stay with the headlines, the polarized headlines, and you're talking politics and religion without killing each other, right? I mean, the whole thing is about the polarized world that we're living in. It does seem a little bit hopeless sometimes, but I think I did find some hope by seeing some of these local people. I was talking about Mississippi. We talked about Duluth already. I was really moved by what I found in Mississippi, and so I grew up in Jackson, which is kind of the biggest city in Mississippi. But this work is happening up in the Delta. It's up in the northwest part of the state, near the Mississippi River, south of Memphis. Very rural, very poor, not a lot of resources, and yet this intrepid group of like a dozen people basically got together, some black, some white, and said, we need to tell the truth about what happened here with Emmett Till. It's been buried. Nobody wants to talk about it, but it's still a part of how we got to be this divided racial community that we continue to be. But this meant that in this very rural, like the county seat town is Sumner, Mississippi, it has a population of 600. Right. So we're talking about a very rural place here. And so that means that all these families know each other. Right. And they know their grandparents. Yeah. And so this history is very personal and close to the ground. And yet what we saw is, or what I saw is descendants of enslavers and descendants of the enslaved and sharecroppers coming to and knowing that like your great great grandfather owned my great great grandfather, like that kind of thing. Came together despite that history to try to move their local community forward to a different place. And they knew they had to tell the truth about this very tough thing. And again, not many resources. This is a very grassroots thing. And they have really succeeded with, now there are historical markers telling the story of Emmett Till. If you'd gone as recently as like 2000 to the Mississippi Delta, there's literally nothing there to tell the story. And so there are now markers there. They've renovated the courthouse to put it back the way it was during the Emmett Till trial. And the most recent thing they've done is based on that work that they did, President Biden just announced just a month ago that there will be now an Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley national monument. But that would not have happened without this groundwork being done on the ground. So now there will be something that will be perpetually maintained by the National Park Service with federal support. But it all began really with this group of people that said, we want to heal our community, and we can't do that without telling the truth about this divisive event in our past.
Yeah. And do you know if there's been any progress in clearing space? That was the last part, that it wasn't easy to access where the body was likely found.
Yeah. All that's, I mean, I think with the federal support and as part of the National Park Service, all of that, is going to be set up so that it'll be easy to find. I mean, I had to get somebody to show me where it is. All right. It's in a very remote, down beside a field, kind of thing. And so, yes, access to all that will be improved. There'll be better signage and educational markers in parks and that kind of thing. So that it can be part of, a destination that you can come, bring a family, and kind of learn this kind of part of American history and see a community that's recovering from it.
I apologize, by the way. Charles Mingus III, my dog, is he's really exercised about all of this
all right.
this topic.
No worries.
Charlie, come here, buddy. Charles. Anyway.
That's right. You just got to put him on camera. Yeah.
Yeah. He always likes to participate. There are so many individuals that you describe in the book in the three separate regions, and one in particular that really caught my attention. I don't even know if she's still alive. It was a white woman in Mississippi, in this area, that was in the courthouse when the trials were happening.
Yeah.
And she was part of the conversations later on. I think they started in the early 90s about, these conversations have had to take place over decades. Is she? Right. She's not still alive, is she?
She is.
Oh, she is. She must be like in her late 90s.
She is. Yeah, she's in her 90s. She's living in California.
Oh, wow.
But she is, in fact, still very much alive, and an amazing person. She comes from a long family. Bobo was her last name, and she is just this like feisty leader. Is like, get this done, and like I had people tell me like. I asked one guy like why he agreed to serve on the Emmett Till Memorial Commission, which is the group that got off all the stuff. And he's like, if she asked me to do it, I'm absolutely not going to say no to her. Right.
Oh, that's great.
And so she was like a real driving force. Jerome Little, who's one of the first African-American men elected after the Voting Rights Act, which finally allowed African-Americans in the Delta to vote. Was also kind of spearheading this event. And one quick thing about him, he grew up in the area, just in the same area where Emmett Till was killed, did not hear the story of Emmett Till until he enlisted in the army and was in France.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and you
just... It was like down the road from him, right? And he came back and was like, okay, we have to tell the story, right? The world knows the story, and we're suppressing it, back here at home.
And you described that about your own upbringing. That's where you went to high school and college. Yeah. And as you said, nowhere to be found in Mississippi's public school textbooks or history curriculum. So a lot of encouraging change is happening, but there's still so much work to do. There's so much else. I didn't even get to ask you about how you started PRRI and, how you got that off the ground. But that's for another conversation, I guess.
All right.
I'll have to have you back.
Yeah, happy to come back.
So I want to ask you the TP&R question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across such grave differences like the ones we're talking about today? People who think differently than we do, who have different beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do, or are educated from different textbooks than we were. How can we be better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
Well, I'm going to give like one answer from stuff I've seen work on the ground. It's very concrete, and I think some of those promising places I've seen it happen is when a predominantly white church and a predominantly black church decide not just to do something one-off like, oh, let's have our pastors swap pulpits for Thanksgiving, not that kind of thing, but decide to be in relationship with one another over time, right? To commit to, and again, it's usually things like potlucks and service projects, and it's things that allow the people to get to know each other over time that I've seen be really transformative. Because what ends up happening, I'll give you one example. So I mentioned my parents are from Macon, Georgia, and many generations back from that area. There were two Baptist churches I actually wrote about in the last book from there. They're both called First Baptist Church. One's predominantly white, one's predominantly black. But they began this process of just saying, we're close by each other, but we essentially ignore each other, and we're going to stop doing that. We're going to start like building in some Easter egg rolls for the kids, potluck dinners, like those kinds of things. Just very informal, not even religious really, but just things to kind of get to know one another. And some things ended up really changing the dynamics, and I think particularly for the assumptions that the white church, would come with, and just realizing, things like when Trayvon Martin was shot, for example, I think the white church and the pastor talked to me and said, I would hope that we would have addressed that in our church had we not been in relationship with this African American church. But honestly, I'm not sure we would have. It would have seemed like something that didn't concern us. Right. But because they knew that there were people that they knew now who were hurting, who were scared, who were angry, they knew they had to address it, both kind of in their own congregation and by kind of showing up for the other one. So I think it takes that kind of, it's not rocket science really, but it takes some grit and resolve and some time.
Yeah. I'm skeptical, but I hope I'm not cynical, because the churches I'm most familiar with, the political and social commitments are primary, and the theological commitments are secondary. And the political gets backed into the theological. So shards of scripture are utilized and deployed to substantiate these political convictions, right? So it makes that type of marriage, it makes that type of collaboration and partnership almost impossible, because certain things are non-negotiable, Yeah.
Well, it does if you start with the politics, but I think if you start with the relationship, it's different, because what has to happen is there has to be a certain level of trust. Yeah. Right. That's brought up so that, when, there's an offhanded remark about, let's take, a police shooting of an African-American, person, and some white person says, well, if they just obeyed the police officer, none of this would have happened. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's something I think white people feel pretty free to say. And from their own experience, that feels true. But if you're in a relationship that has enough trust in it, and you're with another African-American person, they're going to say, well, hold on a minute. Let me tell you about what happened to my nephew. Right. Let me tell you about my experience the last time I got pulled over. Right. And that's different, right? Then it's not about like what I saw on Fox News versus what you saw, on NPR, or what you heard on NPR. But it's about like shared real experience. And I think it gets us out of our corners, a bit, but it's the relationship has to be there, because otherwise, it'll feel too risky for any of that conversation to even happen.
Yeah, it's too transactional and it's not relational. You're right, but when it's your friend who can explain, no, I don't think you understand. Trayvon wears the same sneakers that my brother wears. That's why it's personal. That's why I'm mourning. Then it's as you say, it's relational. Wow, I have so many more questions. I literally have 12 pages of quotes from the book.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So we didn't get into, we just scratched the surface, which means everybody's got to go out and buy the book. It's so edifying. It's so informative. It's convicting. It's hard. But it's really, as if everybody's going to watch the video, but, I was grateful to have both the digital and the hard copy, because I was going back and forth. It was great. Before I have a couple more questions, but before we get to that, do you have any questions for me?
Oh, it's interesting. I guess I'd love to know. So, you've read the book, and as you said, there's some pretty tough stuff. There's some hopeful stuff. I don't know, where on that range of hope and despair did you end up, I think, after reading the book?
It depends what I think of first.
Yeah.
If the first thought that pops into my brain is the Bobo family, I can picture her, I can picture some of these conversations, some of these tough conversations that are happening, and the commitment, the gritty commitment of the people in that room that are having that hard conversation, and how one word in a statement is worth having conversations about and coming back to the table about, and allowing people to go through a mourning process and even get pissed. If we trust each other, we can afford to be pissed at something and then still come back and continue to work it out. So that part gives me hope. But there are so many parts that I recognize myself in it. Even something relatively benign like Cowboys and Indians, I recognize myself in that. And that's daunting. But I also get pissed because there have been more than one Bible studies that I was kicked out of because the assumptions that we make sometimes seem subtle and benign, but it's in the tradition of something that's really poisonous, really deeply rooted and poisonous. And just asking that question, there's this natural defensiveness that happens that you're almost not allowed to ask in a predominantly white church or white Christian community. My kids went to this Christian school. It was predominantly white. And you're not even allowed to ask that question. You're not even allowed to say, hey, wait a second. You're quoting from a piece of scripture that if you just get to the end of the chapter, it comes to a very different conclusion about, for example, immigration. So it just, I don't necessarily wrestle with the theological profundity of Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Jesus, right? Because that keeps on bringing me back, but I wrestle with the people that claim Jesus. That's what I'm so ambivalent about. So I don't know if that answers your question, man.
Yeah,
but
no, it's helpful.
Yeah. It's sometimes it's a little bit more dark, sometimes it's a little bit more light, and I'm bouncing. Hopefully, I'll meander my way forward.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing on that? I think one of the things I'm hoping, because I think it's been necessary for me, it's so easy, I think, for people who are white and Christian to look away. Yeah. Right? To kind of get a little bit of this and go, oh, I can't. Right. And I think one of the things I've been trying to do for myself, and then trying to encourage other people who look like me to do, is to just hold the gaze a little longer. Yeah. And again, not just for the sake of feeling bad, but I think at the end of the day, it's for the sake of integrity, right? That we've got to be able to see where we've gone so wrong if we're going to go somewhere right. Yeah. It's a hard exercise, but a necessary one. So how can folks follow you, find more information about the new book, more info on PRRI, and all the great work that you're doing? Well, thank you. So the book is it is available wherever books are sold. There's an audio book, there's an ebook, there's a hardcover. So however you want to read it, it's there. I'm writing weekly at robertpjones.substack.com. That's a free newsletter, kind of following along, on this, continuing this journey even beyond the book. And then at PRRI, it is prrri.org. We are a kind of nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization conducting public opinion surveys for the most part at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. Awesome. Yeah, that's our bailiwick. That's our sweet spot. That's why I love your organization so much. This has really been great. It's such a thrill to get to know you personally. Like I said, I've heard so many great things about you. I've read a lot of your work, and this has really been fun. I hope we get to do it in person someday real soon. Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, thanks.
So thank you. Thank all of you as well. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, subscribe, rate, review, and tell somebody about talking politics and religion without killing each other. Seriously, take the time to write a review. Really makes a difference. And telling a friend about a particular episode like this one or what we're trying to do overall, it might end up spurring you into a great conversation. And you could be talking politics and religion without killing each other. We're simple to find. It's politicsandreligion.us. www.politicsandreligion.us. You can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. It's Corey with an E and S is the Sam at Corey S. Nathan. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.